you so much, Caroline and Lai. On behalf of the People's Coalition on Food Sovereignty and the Arab Network for Food Sovereignty and the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature, I would like to thank you, the organizing committee and the ILPS Commission too, for this opportunity. It's always an honor, an inspiration, a source of hope and strength to come together as people to discuss one of the most important challenges of our time, a time where one child is going to hunger every minute, where more and more countries are going to be food insecure. In the minutes given to me, I would like to raise a few questions for us in the debate, and maybe shed some light on our region, which is considered to be the most affected by the food crisis, and then offer some conclusions. So I hope you can follow up with me so that together we can come up with a good discussion. I will try to answer some questions. Firstly, the question, is this food crisis a coincidence? Is it a coincidence that the US Air Force targeted 300 hectares of agricultural land planted with wheat crops in Syria in the year 2020? Is the explosion of the port in Lebanon and the silos of wheat is a coincidence in 2020? Are the fires that broke out in Iraq in Salah ad-Din district in year 2021 a coincidence? The burning of 90 acres of land in Sudan in 2020 also was unintentional. Tunisian question now whether the burned crops back in 2019 were also a coincidence. Jordanians still are wondering why their wheat silos were demolished in Aqaba port in 2018. A few weeks ago, occupation forces burned down the wheat crops in the town of Nablus, where I was born in Palestine. Was the selection of that land random? Finally, how did the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war this year coincide with the massive wildfire that erupted in Egypt to burn 76 tons of wheat this year? So this is my first question. The other one, is the food crisis new? i.e., did it start with the Ukrainian war? We all know that the global food prices have been rising over the past 20 years. The same drivers of the 2008 and 2011 food crisis, such as fuel price spikes, financial speculations, and imperialist wars, these were the drivers of increasing food prices that time. They are the same drivers increasing food prices in the year 2022. Already, uprisings in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Egypt have shown stark similarities with massive food price related protests in 2008. One of the drivers, or better framed as root causes, is the increase of farmland prices and the commodification of land, which have peaked higher in the past few decades, prompting a 122% increase in the number of transitional land deals from year 2011 to 2020. Also, in the last few months, numerous countries have signed new agreements with the rich countries like the Emirates and the Saudi Arabia for food export production and land leasing. These countries, some of these countries are Tunisia, Guyana, Tanzania, and Sudan. An agricultural company in Pakistan recently signed $1 billion deal with Chinese and Saudi Arabian companies which will allow the country's exports to grow. Last year, a report from the International Land Coalition revealed that land concentration is much worse than we know, and the trajectory is leading to a few landlords and companies operating farmlands in poor countries. Another root cause is breakdown of the food systems due to wars, conflicts, and occupation. And my colleague Gertrude, who's a comrade since long, know that the conflict and the wars were not considered as triggers of hunger before the civil society and grassroots movements have pushed that into the platforms of negotiations. 60% of the world's hungry live in countries affected by conflict. More than half of the 124 million acutely hungry people live in parts of the world where there is conflicts and fighting and violence. Agriculture and trade are disrupted and plate where in these countries, and a plate of food may cost more than a day's wages. And you can see many examples, like in Afghanistan, now we have 93% hunger. In Brazil, where they had zero hunger for one time and they alleviated hunger for millions, now that we have 60% of the families are facing hunger again. Extreme weather events driven by climate change is another factor or a root cause. It plays a role in the disruption of food production. Over the past 40 years, the planet has lost 12 million hectares of arable land each year due to the drought and desertification. 1/3 of arable land was also lost due to erosion and pollution. To add to these causes, over the past 40 years, we have witnessed a transformation towards unsustainable consumption and unhealthy diets. Meat consumption has increased drastically, which has an enormous environmental footprint and pressure on productive resources. We can list many other causes and examples for this chronic food crisis, but essential fact remains that our vulnerability to these causes is tied to our enslavement by the global market system and our ability to resist the destruction of our local food systems by colonial and neo-colonial forces, including pressures by powerful actors and international financial institutions to marginalize our agricultural sectors. Therefore, the crisis is indeed not new, but escalates more during certain global events such as COVID pandemic. Between 2020 and February 2022, FAO's food price index went up by 55.2%, led by 159% rise in prices of edible oils, followed by strong growth in prices of sugar, dairy, and cereal. Due to COVID-19, global domestic supply chains have collapsed and food supply chains haven't been spared. The pandemic unleashed a chain crisis for international shipping, with ports closed, ships remained at sea for months in a row. COVID-19 has also resulted in a major disruption to the movement of domestic and migrant workers who have a major role in agricultural production. Freight costs have gone up sharply. Export restrictions increased during the pandemic. There were increasing concerns about food availability, which led to grain producing countries imposing export restrictions, which had 16% share in global rice exports. Now Vietnam, which had 16% share in global rice exports before the pandemic, held back on granting rice export certificates till the end of April 2020. Kazakhstan suspended exports of several cereal products oilseeds, vegetables until 2020, June 2020. Russia placed restrictions on the export of items such as wheat, corn. Consequently, food prices started picking up in the second half of the 2020, with the prices of cereals and edible oil witnessing strong growth since then. Fertilizer issue is very important. Prices have also increased in fertilizers due to the rising price of natural gas. Average monthly natural gas prices, as indicated by the World Bank's Natural Gas Index, went up by nearly 600% between June 2020 and December 2021. A big new event adding to the chronic crisis, food crisis, of course, is the current war between Russia and Ukraine. According to FAO, food prices went up by 12.4% in March 2022. From February to March, the increase was 12.4%, and it's likely that this rise wouldn't be the last, especially if the conflict drags on for a much longer time. Russia and Ukraine are the world's largest exporters of barley, corn, rapeseed, sunflower seeds, and sunflower oil, and wheat, as well as fertilizers. If we come to Ukraine, Ukraine accounts for nearly 10% of global wheat export, with a war-ranging on its soil breakdown of internal transportation and the blockage on its coastline. The country's export shipments have been disrupted. Ukraine also accounts for more than a quarter of the world's production of sunflower seed, with supply disruptions and fears of more to come. Safflower oil is witnessing sharp price hikes. Continuation of the conflict also puts at risk the sowing of crops later this year in Ukraine, which will weigh on global wheat, barley, maize, rapeseed, and sunflower production. If we come to Russia, Russia too is a major agricultural exporter, with major shares in global production of sunflower seed, barley, and wheat. It accounts for 18% of global wheat exports. The war is also driving up the cost of food production, because both Russia and Ukraine used to export 28% of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers and 40% of potash. Russia alone used to export 48% of the world's ammonium nitrate and 11% of the world's urea. Soaring fertilizer prices, meanwhile, may result in lower use of fertilizers, thereby denting crop yields in major fertilizer importers. Of course, shipment from Russia and Belarus face disruption due to sanctions. Before I come to my conclusion, I will speak a little bit about the impact of food crisis on our region, the West Asia, North Africa, or the Arab world, we call it, as it is the least food sufficient and the biggest importer of wheat in the world. We import 30% of the global wheat market. In our region, do you still hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Okay. In our, it is, as I told you, it's the least sufficient and the biggest importer of wheat. In our region, where wheat has been first domesticated, we plant only 30% of our arable land. We have 200 million hectares of arable land. We only plant 30%. And we sadly say that this region was the first to plant wheat in the world in Iraq, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. In Egypt, where bread is named Aish, which means life, prices are rising dramatically. The country is the world's top wheat importer, with nearly 70% of its wheat coming from Russia and Ukraine in 2019. Lebanon imports 52% of its wheat from Russia. More than a third of Yemen's wheat comes from the Black Sea region. Ravaged by years of war that have pushed millions to the brink of famine, Yemen is highly dependent on bread, which makes up over half of the calorie intake for the average household. So as we see, our region, which is rich in resources, and the Africa region, where we see that 13 out of 15 countries face very, very high risks of very high rates of hunger are in Africa. So there comes to my mind another question. How come these regions, which are, and some of the Asian also regions, very high in resources, are facing higher rates of food insecurity and higher and a bigger food crisis? If we want to gather all these questions, we might have a very interesting discussion, and it will lead us to some conclusions. Some of our conclusions that prices are at their highest level since 1990, while high food inflation impacts all of us. Low-income countries and the most vulnerable communities and families are the most affected. This includes small food producers, farmers, agricultural workers, and landless peasants who make up more than 2/3 of the world's extremely poor. We have sought to answer two questions in this presentation. Is the crisis a coincidence, and is it new? We conclude that it's neither a coincidence, as the underlying causes are mostly man-made, and that it is surely not new, as these causes have been present prior to the Russian-Ukrainian war, and have therefore led to many previous food crises. These root causes will inevitably lead to other escalating crises in the future should we fail to tackle them. Pandemics and wars are manifestations of our vulnerability, and their painful repercussions will continue until we recognize our strengths as movements to change this narrative towards sovereign food systems. This impending crisis is merely a reminder that food sovereignty should be a priority for our social, economic, and political security. But how do we realize this vision? We have first to protect and enhance local food systems and communities' rights to own, manage resources such as land, water, and seeds. We must cultivate food staples such as wheat to improve food security, and should be prioritized over crops intended for export, because we have all the attention in our region is to export rather than planting wheat for food security. We have to work to build food reserves and invest in regional strategies for food security. And we have to continue to campaign for ending wars, conflicts, and occupations. We have to work for canceling debt owed to international finance institutions and private international lenders. And we have to continue mobilizing farmer and worker organizations, indigenous peoples and women's organizations to unite and take the leadership to drive the economic transformations urgently needed. I would like here to stop and to thank you for listening. And I'm eager to listen for Gertrude's reaction and to hear, to hear the brainstorming together, to work together and to unite our efforts. Thank you so much.